So you can keep coming and seeking God, may God go with you. For those who come embracing life, may life return your affection. And to those who come to seek the path, may your way be found, and the courage to take it step by step.
Our reading this morning is a poem entitled The Sacrament of Waiting by Macrina Whitaker. Slowly, she celebrated the sacrament of letting go. First, she surrendered her green, then the orange, yellow, and red. Finally, she let go of her brown. Shedding her last leaf, she stood empty and silent, stripped bare. Leaning against the winter sky, she began her vigil of trust. Shedding her last leaf, she watched it journey to the ground. She stood in silence, wearing the color of emptiness. Her branches wondering, how do you give shade with so much gone? And then the sacrament of waiting began. The sunrise and sunset watched with tenderness. Clothing her with silhouettes, they kept her hope alive. They helped her understand that her vulnerability, her dependence and need, her emptiness, her readiness to receive were giving her a new kind of beauty. Every morning and every evening they stood in silence and celebrated together the sacrament of waiting. Before you leave, ladies, I just want to tell you, I was sitting while you were singing, watching the dust motes dancing. It fit perfectly. Thank you for your music. It was early and it was dark when I got out of bed on Wednesday morning. I looked out the window and was disappointed to see the clouds. But I got dressed anyway and went outside to scan the western sky. Now I say scan the western sky like I live on an open prairie or something. But if you've ever driven through Swarthmore, you know that basically our number one product is trees. And so when I say scan the open sky, what I actually did was I faced to the west and I tried to find a gap in the canopy so I could see the sky. And once I found that, I started to move around until I could see it. And I could see the moon in the gap of the trees. And there it was. The clouds had cleared, and I could see the eclipse just starting. I stood and I stared as the shadow of the earth slowly crept across the face of the moon. I got a text from my sister in Rochester, New York, who was watching it from her bedroom window. I don't think I've ever told you, but I come from a family of space nuts. And I startled some joggers who were passing by on the sidewalk who didn't see this fool standing in his yard looking up at the sky at 5:30 in the morning. I said, "Have you seen the eclipse?" And they jumped back and they ran a little faster. And I put a post on Facebook, of course, urging people to get out of bed and to look up into the sky. And I think a few of you did. When I say that I stood there, that isn't exactly true either, because every few minutes as the eclipse developed, I needed to shift my position to keep the moon centered in that gap between the trees. As I did that, as I stood there and saw the moon shift in relation to the trees, I could actually see and feel the rotation of the earth beneath my feet, drawing down the moon toward the western horizon. When I realized what was happening, I felt a kind of oneness with the forces of time and nature as I tried to keep that eclipse in view. But soon it became kind of a cat and mouse game, because the lower the moon went, the more my window of visibility closed. And so as the leaves began to obscure my view, I made the decision to run down the street to the open soccer field that's at the end. And I was hoping, as I did, that I wouldn't lose that last sliver of light before I got there. I really wanted to see the eclipse move into totality. And it didn't. I got there in time to see the moon's light totally dimmed as it hovered over the Swarthmore College campus. And I stood there as the moon, with this faint pink glow, sank below the horizon, out of sight. It was a spectacular show on Wednesday morning. And I know that some of you saw it. I wish you all had the chance. With our modern scientific knowledge, we know how and why lunar eclipses occur, when they'll happen, and where you need to be to see them. But as I stood watching the moon disappear before my very eyes, I couldn't help but think of our ancient ancestors. How frightening it must have been, especially for those people who worshiped the moon as a goddess or who regulated their lives around the lunar cycles, to see the moon dissolving. Imagine the horror, too, if the eclipsed moon sank into the horizon as it did this week before it had time to come out of totality. So the moon disappears and then sets. They had no idea whether they were ever going to see the moon again. How frightening and panicked that feeling must have been. And they waited through that next day, wondering if the moon would ever come back. And then I think about how they must have celebrated that next night, the wild celebrations they had when the moon came back. Armed with modern knowledge, we can set our clocks to wake us up when these events are going to occur. But when time was set by normal cycles of light and dark, of waxing and waning, a lunar eclipse was probably the stuff of nightmares. There are certainly benefits to having the scientific knowledge that we've gained over the years. We can prepare for oncoming disasters like hurricanes. We can harness the power of the wind and water and fire. We don't have to go crazy when a shadow is cast across the moon. But at the same time, I think we've lost something too. As we seek to protect ourselves from the forces of nature, we've lost touch with our animal selves, our primal senses. We've alienated ourselves from the world. As I stood in my yard early on Wednesday morning, feeling connected to the Earth's rotation and the moon's descent in the sky, I realized that the last time I had felt that way was nearly 20 years ago. Nearly 20 years ago. I was camped out below the summit of Mount Katahdin in Maine with some friends, and as we sat by the campfire, a full harvest moon ascended over the summit. It was bright orange and huge, bigger than a pumpkin. It got very quiet around the campfire at about that moment and stayed that way for a while as we watched the moon creep across the sky. I realize it's been a long time since I felt that connected to nature. And I wonder if perhaps you've felt that way recently. There is wisdom in the seasons and the cycles of nature. Most of us are familiar with the words of the 3rd chapter of Ecclesiastes in the Old Testament, even if we're only familiar with Pete Seeger's adaptation of those words. For everything there is a season and a time for every matter under heaven, a time to be born and a time to die, a time to plant and a time to pluck that which is planted, a time to kill and a time to heal, a time to break down and a time to build up, a time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to mourn and a time to dance, and so on. These words fall under the category of wisdom literature in the Bible, and in fact the word Ecclesiastes can be loosely translated as teacher or sometimes even preacher. The author of these lines tells us in other parts of Ecclesiastes that all human struggling and all our attempts to gain knowledge pale in comparison to the power and the persistence of the natural world. That when we stand apart from nature, we are nothing more than a vain and fleeting presence that is soon lost to the vagaries of time. These words are a reminder, or perhaps even an admonition, that we need to stay in touch with the cycles of nature, that our lives should be spent in concert with the changing seasons. In losing our connection to nature, we lose touch with the processes of change and transformation that are inherent in the natural world. We pay lip service to the constancy of change. We do as human beings. We pay lip service to that, and yet we find ourselves resisting change, often with every fiber of our being. And you heard Marjorie's wonderful words about her experience with change. And so I invite you now to listen again to our reading, the poem by Macrina Widecker. And as you do, I invite you to compare your own internal resistance to or acceptance of change. Compare that to the tree's acceptance of change. The sacrament of waiting. Slowly, she celebrated the sacrament of letting go. First, she surrendered her green, then the orange, yellow, and red, and finally the brown. Shedding her last leaf, she stood empty and silent, stripped bare. Leaning against the winter sky, she began her vigil of trust. Shedding her last leaf, she watched it journey to the ground. She stood in silence, wearing the color of emptiness, her branches wondering, how do you give shade with so much gone? And then the sacrament of waiting began. The sunrise and sunset watched with tenderness, clothing her with silhouettes that kept her hope alive. They helped her understand that her vulnerability, her dependence and need, her emptiness, her readiness to receive were giving her a new kind of identity. Every morning and every evening they stood in silence and celebrated together the sacrament of waiting. Can you imagine actually celebrating letting go? Can you imagine how our vulnerability, our dependence, our need might give us a readiness to receive? Can you imagine how, stripped of all we had and all we were, and standing bare, we might see ourselves as having a new kind of beauty? What, the tree asks us, does it take for us to let go of the things that define us, or perhaps the people we hold most dear? I'm not advocating a return to primitive society. I love my gadgets as much as the next person. But what if we were to consciously try to restore our relationship with the physical world? What if we were to reclaim some of our animal nature? What, I wonder, are some of the forgotten lessons that our ancient forebears, whose lives were so closely tied to the seasons and the cycles, simply took for granted? The first one that comes to mind for me is that it can't be summer all year round. In our quick-fix self-help society, we've somehow come to believe that we should always be happy, or at least be content and satisfied. But nature tells us that this simply isn't so. Summer is unsustainable, even in the most temperate of climates. Were we to listen to the wisdom of the sun and the moon and the earth, we might just stop trying so badly and yearning so badly to always keep our lives sunny and in the mid-70s. Another lesson might be about the paradox of autumn, this beautiful, beautiful time of year. Autumn is the time of harvest. It's about reaping what we've sown. It's about being grateful for what we've earned or been given. It's about feasting on the fruits of our labors. And And amidst all this plenty, in this time of joyous celebration and thanksgiving, autumn teaches us that we are also in the process of dying. That is the paradox. The leaves on the trees are beautiful because the tree is pulling back and denying them nutrients. They are about to fall. The corn stalks, whether grown to full maturity or perhaps just stunted, will be cut down and will return to the earth. And so nature calls us to hold these two competing emotions within us, that we are blessed beyond measure and that we are ultimately and inextricably destined to experience the winter of our souls. And of course, winter, in all its guises, is inevitable. We are bound to suffer through gray days and long, cold, dark nights of our spirits. There will be times in our lives where we withdraw from the world, where we simply need to hibernate, where all our inner reserves will be consumed, where we'll have nothing to give anyone else, where we simply are struggling to make it through the next day or the next hour or the next minute. And what the season tells us is that this is all right. It's natural. It happens. It doesn't mean that we don't need to seek the help of others when it gets too bad. But there's nothing inherently wrong with us. Nothing wrong with us just because we suffer, because we are in grief or despair, or we have anxiety or depression. Just as it can't be summer all the time, we are destined, all of us, to experience winters in our lives. And then there is spring. Perhaps the greatest lesson of all that we can take from the cycles and seasons of nature is to have faith and to hold on to our belief that spring will arrive. Somehow, through grace, through hard work, through the compassionate caring of others around us, somehow, sometime, spring will show up. In the darkest nights of winter, it's hard to believe, I know. I've been there. But nature inevitably says yes to spring. It might rush in all at once, unexpectedly on an early date on the calendar, or it might just creep in ever so slowly and timidly that we barely notice it as the ice slowly recedes and it leaves behind that mud and road salt and all the debris of that awful winter. But one way or another, spring shows up. So it is with our spirits and with ourselves. The seasons of our souls don't follow the cycles of nature, nor are they predictable or prone to calendaring like a lunar eclipse. We don't know when our own moon will be eclipsed by another passing body, nor can we force ourselves to bloom like a hothouse flower. But as we enjoy these crisp, clear autumn days and nights, let us learn from the earth and all the heavenly bodies, that we may live fully in whatever season we find ourselves, today, tomorrow, and in the days ahead. This day and every day, I wish you peace. Amen.